Bonjour, bonjour, mon amis. Bienvenue à notre Cooking avec Tyler. This show's premise has been completely lost at this point. In this episode of Cooking with Tyler, I bring forth a presentation on how free speech has been blown out of proportion in recent years. For the sake of time, we will be skipping the preparations in this episode, but here's a list of them if you are a newcomer to the show. Now, let's get on with it.
Super Mario in real life.
As many of you already know, free speech is one of the 14 indivisible human rights. Many of us nowadays, including myself, take this commodity for granted. But you're not here to listen to me talk about all the things I take for granted. You're here for the title of the video, The Tyler Cooking Show. Let's start out by discussing how free speech even came about. Freedom of speech has a long history in the United States that predates even the International Human Rights Act of today. The history behind freedom of speech goes back to 6th century Greece in the city of Athens. You may or may not have heard of this tiny town in a historically insignificant country, but who am I to judge? In 594 BC, a man by the name of Solon created the basis for what's known as Athenian democracy, which is the oldest recorded implementation of free speech in history. It was natural in Greek democracy to allow everyday citizens to participate in assembly meetings, which back in those days was the equivalent of our modern parliament. Comprised of only 400 council members, the ecclesia, or assembly in English, tackled things that our parliament does today. On one of those tablets it stated, "All those who live upon the land of Atesia, Athens, are apt to open one's mouth with intent in contrast to that of ecclesia, common law, and another man's assessment." Which in human terms means that if you have a differing opinion than what may be commonly accepted, you can express that opinion without being slandered. Fast forward a few hundred years, and you have more people starting to look back at this point in history and think, dang, that freedom of speech thing was cool. So some people got together in England and thought, hey, we need to try out this thing from old Athens about freedom of speech. And thus, they passed their 1689 Bill of Rights Act that, along with setting up a semi-modern societal structure, also established the legality of freedom of speech. France also followed not long after their revolution in 1789. Both England and France believed that this right was inalienable, and to refuse someone of their opinion was like telling a teen what they can and can't do. It's impossible. We won't comment on this semi-big skirmish at this time in history that may have violated everything set inside of these acts. Turn the airport to a shooting range, let my... When creating the First Amendment, James Madison cited a section from one of Cato's letters. The documents promoted liberty and staunchly disagreed with how much the British Crown saw over the American populace. The document wrote, "Freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together." Madison believed that when adopted in the U.S., freedom of speech should be a natural right, not an earned one. On December 15, 1791, the United States adopted what's known as the First Amendment. It states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Put it simply, so long as you're not actively threatening action against the government or a group of people, then your speech is protected under free speech. God bless America. Not really, but you can't tell me what to think, so suck it.
At least my phone don't crack when it drops.
I feel the need to bring up this example before getting into some heavier topics. A man by the name of Charles Schenck was caught by police trying to convince people to dodge the draft for World War I, as he saw that service across the seas in regions we don't belong in is bogus. We have more important matters at home. The United States government saw this as a violation of free speech limitations, as he was actively trying to obstruct the draft and hinder the ability of the draft itself. Prior to this case, there had never been a case presented in which the First Amendment was put into question. When an action is threatening danger, the state has all right to abridge such actions. I can't think of a joke to put right here, so instead, here's a picture of a cat I found on Google Images.
Don't be stupid, be a smarty. Come and join the Nazi party.
The 1930s saw the beginning of things that everyone loves to this day. Big band jazz, frozen foods, Zippo lighters, whipped cream, and Nazis. As they say, all was well in the 1920s, and then Nazis came to ruin it all. And I've yet to find a situation where this statement is not true. The year is 1933. The far right ascend inside of Germany's government. At its top, a man known by the name of Adolf Schmittler. For those of you who aren't educated in the matter, Nazism emphasized German nationalism, an icing of irredentism, with a sprinkle of expansionism. The backbone of the belief spawned from the Germans wanting Lebensraum, living space in English. They believed that the Aryan race was superior above all, and everyone else must make room for the dominants to come in and rightfully inhabit their lands. Just by this intro, you're already seeing where this is going. Over the course of World War II, hundreds of thousands were displaced from their homes, whether it be by force or by other means. It's not a surprise that this is also a violation of human rights, specifically Articles 22 through 25, which to sum up states that one may not be yoded from one's crib without a claim, evidence, and or reasoning. These atrocities only got worse throughout the course of the war. In Stalingrad alone, there were so many people fleeing east to get away from the Germans, Stalin needed to enact Order Number 227, which stated that falling back was no longer an option. Civilians were forced to take up arms to fight the German occupants. You may wonder why Germany wasn't also charged with violations of human rights. This is because they weren't universally enforced then. While Germany had major repercussions from the aftermath of World War II, you had to have a pretty compelling argument to accuse a German of violating human rights at the time, because in Germany, there was no such thing. Immediately after World War II, a council of the most politically powerful countries started to devise a plan so that if a war of this scale happens again, there will be more definitive laws to abide by, making prosecuting a war criminal much easier. Some say that if it wasn't for World War II, human rights may have not been universally instituted for quite a while longer. After the war, the world's leading countries needed to act fast on getting something created that made acts of human rights violations universally illegal. When the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany became fully apparent after World War II, the consensus within the world community was that the United Nations Charter did not sufficiently define the rights to which it referred. A universal declaration that specified the rights of individuals was necessary to give effect to the Charter's provisions of human rights. Sorry, that one was directly out of Wikipedia. So the leading nations gathered in 1948 to create what's known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was a giant piece of paper that basically stated that all people living on this planet have God-given rights that may not be taken away by any one authority. The Declaration has 30 articles within it, but the ones we care about primarily are the 18th and 19th. This is not to say that the other ones aren't also useful to know. The 18th and 19th articles state that all may have the freedom of religion, thought, expression, and peaceful association. It is our duty as a member in society to uphold the use of these rights.
I'll whoop your
Push.
Your girlfriend look like my mom.
A very crucial thing to keep in mind in modern day is that the First Amendment protects you from the government doing things to try and deny your speech, but not anyone else. This subtext is very often overlooked in modern day society. Just because you could drop the N-word in public doesn't mean that you should drop the N-word in public. You in fact do not have the absolute right to say whatever you want to whoever you want, wherever you want. If you do so, expect heavy repercussions. You are fully eligible to be fired from a job for speaking out against your boss, and you can't argue the first against it. This brings us into the misconceptions of free speech. No, in fact, you do not get free reign over what you can say. No, you can't use obscenities in public. And no, you can't threaten violent action against anyone using speech in any form. These are just some of the biggest misconceptions of free speech we have today. Let's take a look at a few of them. Most see symbolic speech as a sort of gray area between what is and what isn't allowed in free speech. And to put it simply, there is no gray area here whatsoever. Some people who didn't like the armband someone was wearing one time is where the spawn of this gray area comes from. Symbolic speech is 100% not a violation of free speech in any way, shape, or form, and shouldn't be treated as such. That is, unless you're acting violently. Also an important thing to mention, if you get any funny ideas after watching this, please refrain. Do not go into your school wearing a shirt that says "more bong for your buck" and expect to not be suspended. Also, don't tell them that I said this. Unprotected speech is speech that is not protected by the First Amendment. A good example of this is quote-unquote fighting words. Fighting words are labeled as words that institute action against another person. For example, "get your butt back over here" is an interaction that would likely result in a fight between the participants, which is forbidden by law. The biggest problem of free speech that I see today is people thinking that free speech is also conjoint with private businesses. This, as I've already stated, is not true. If you are in school, you have to follow the school's guidelines, not the government's. The First Amendment doesn't protect you in school. It protects you in court or with the government. Period. Wow, that was a hefty change in course for this show to take. It's really become second nature at this point, though. And remember, although you may think that we could do without free speech, one thing is for certain. It is the backbone of U.S. democracy today. God bless. Thank you for tuning into tonight's airing of the Tyler Cooking Show, and we hope to see you soon.